Go ahead.
Okay, great. So everybody, thank you for joining us. I just wanted to give a little bit of background for people that don't know you. I'm taking everything here from your OU website. You're the director of MJE, the Manhattan Jewish Experience. That's been for the last several years. Prior to that, co-director of the OU's Jewish Learning Initiative on the campus at Boston University, and also regional director for New Jersey and Rockland County at the OU. And I know tonight you'll be joining us and speaking about bar mitzvahs during this age of pandemic and COVID times. A lot of different changes to what people are able to do and what they cannot. And I think it's been a big adjustment. So I know you've personally been affected. Your son recently becoming a bar mitzvah, so mazel tov on that. And I'm very happy to hear about your take on the situation and some of the challenges. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you so much, Jesse. It's a pleasure to be here. I am also a fellow teenager. And as Jesse mentioned, we just had our son's bar mitzvah was this past Shabbos. So it was, in fact, a Corona bar mitzvah, not a bar mitzvah canceled by Corona, because we were actually able to have a minyan in the backyard, which was both nerve-wracking and exciting, because we didn't know it was going to happen until the very last minute, well, so to speak, until like a week or 9 days before the bar mitzvah was going to happen. We had kind of like given up on it. My son had stopped reviewing his laning. We just assumed it wasn't going to happen, and then we had to swing into action to make at least a mini bar mitzvah happen. And we'll talk. We're still going to have a party later on, and we'll talk about what the source for that is as we go through our shir. The class tonight is really about the origins of bar mitzvah celebrations, and we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into some sources about where bar mitzvah comes from and why we celebrate bar mitzvahs the way we do. And you'll either be surprised or unsurprised that there is not a lot of information in either the Tanakh or the Gemara about bar mitzvah celebrations. So, we'll talk about it. So this first thing I'll say is that I used to had an argument with my son, Uriel, who was becoming bar mitzvah, starting from about the time he put on his tefillin, which was at about a month before his bar mitzvah. He started to say, well, now that I'm a man, he'd say that all the time, now that I'm a man, I can, eat dessert before dinner or whatever. And then I would say immediately afterwards, I would say to him, you're not a man, you're just a boy. And he would say, no, I'm a man. I said, no, you're not. He would say that partially because he was gotten to be as tall as I was. Do you want me to let people into the waiting room, or are you or someone else on that? I don't want to let any of you suspicious in, but.
I got it.
Okay, fine. So part of it he was saying because he was as tall as I was now, so, he was just trying to give me a hard time about how he's going to be taller than me. But I said, you don't become a man until you're bar mitzvah. So that's the first idea. Like, is it true that becoming bar mitzvah makes you into a Jewish man? And we'll talk a little bit about bat mitzvah and girls too. So the first thing is I am a little bit of a stickler for this, that the meaning of bar mitzvah is not, it is not a noun referring to the celebrant, to the person who is having bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. It is a status so you don't become a bar mitzvah. That is, the boy is not a bar mitzvah, and he doesn't have a bar mitzvah. It's not a noun referring to the person or to the celebration. What it is a description of their status. They are bar mitzvah, which some people translate it as son of a mitzvah, but that is not correct, and also sounds vaguely like an insult. But it means susceptible to mitzvot or liable for mitzvot. There's only one place in the whole Gemara where it mentions bar mitzvah. It's in Baba Metzia, Daf Tzadi Vav Amud Aleph, 96a. And there it's talking about appointing a master who wants to appoint his servant as a shaliach, as an emissary. And the Gemara asks, how could it be that the master can appoint his servant, his eved, as a shaliach because he is not bar mitzvah? And that doesn't mean he's not 13, and it doesn't mean he didn't have a celebration. It means that he's not, as a servant, he doesn't have the obligation to do that mitzvah. So how could the master ask him to do it if it doesn't apply to him? So in other words, what it means is that a person who becomes bar mitzvah is obligated to do mitzvot, which doesn't, well, we'll have to see it. Does that have to do with being a man or just being obligated to do mitzvot? The other outcome of this is that girls too are bar mitzvah. Meaning, if the whole idea of saying that we have a bat mitzvah is based on a translation of bar mitzvah that means son of a mitzvah. So if you have a bar mitzvah, son of a mitzvah, then you can have a daughter of a mitzvah, which is a bat mitzvah. But if bar mitzvah doesn't mean that, it means that you are now expected to do mitzvot, then both boys and girls become bar mitzvah. So I say this, but I know that I will never change the world. And no one will ever listen to me. So I share it to you for your edification, not because you're going to change the invitations for your daughter's bar mitzvah to say, now that our daughter's becoming bar mitzvah, you should come celebrate with us, because everyone will look at you funny. But now you know. And I will say as follows, that, what was I going to say about this? I don't know. In any case, one other thing I was going to say, I'm sure will come to me. Okay, so I know that I'm not going to change the world, but it happens to be true that that both boys and girls become bar mitzvah. Oh, I know what it was. It will come to me. At the shul that I daven at in Teaneck, which is Rinat, so just a 12-minute mosey up the road from Beth Aaron. In the announcements, they never put bar mitzvah. They put that the boy or the girl has reached a gil mitzvot, has reached the age of mitzvot. And it's a gender neutral way of saying it. And it has the additional benefit of not torturing the Hebrew language. Okay, now, next. So I asked the question to begin with, if it's true that becoming bar mitzvah means that you have become a Jewish man or a Jewish woman, what does it mean to be a man in Judaism? And I'll ask all the questions I would ask about what it means to be an adult in general. Putting aside mitzvot for a second, all the things that I would expect from a man, not describing what masculinity ought to be like per se, but there are things that I would expect of a person who's a man. Number one, do they have emotional maturity? Are they emotionally mature? And the answer for most 13-year-old boys is no. Are they financially independent? That would be a sign of manhood. And the answer for most 13-year-old boys is no. Are they ready to get married? Definitely not. Are they ready to move out of the house? Definitely not. Are they ready to drive an automobile? Okay, that would not have been a question in the Gemara, maybe an ox cart, maybe it was different, I don't know, but no, they're not really ready to drive. That you have to wait till you're 16, and whether or not that's a good idea or not is open for debate. Are they ready to moderate their own drinking of alcohol? Definitely not. Are they ready to vote? I don't know, you could argue about it, but we don't let them. So interestingly, I mean, maybe I'm missing some, I'm sure there's other things. It doesn't seem like in any conventional way in which we describe the responsibilities of being an adult apply to a bar mitzvah boy. So how do we know that a bar mitzvah boy is supposed to be a Jewish man? And is it true? So let's take a look at, I'm going to share with you my sources after that little introduction. Here we go. I'm going to share the screen with you. Okay. So the real source, as far as I know, and as far as I know, it is the earliest source, to the best of my knowledge, of bar mitzvah, comes from Pirkei Avot. And it's chapter 5 of Pirkei Avot, actually almost at the very end. There are some commentaries who believe that this was actually meant to be the last Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, but there are reasons to think that it wasn't supposed to be. It's the third from the end. We're not going to do the whole thing because it goes through a whole life. It goes through the whole lifespan of an individual. But let's do the beginning part of it at least. I'm going to read it in Hebrew and translate to English. I brought both for you here on the screen. What I am going to do is I have a little spotlight. So where I'm reading, you'll be able to follow along with me. Hu haya omer, whoever the rabbi was, it was the rabbi from the previous Mishnah. We won't get into it now. He also used to say the following. He would say, Ben chamesh shanim lamikra. At 5 years old, you should start teaching a child the Torah. Mikra means the Torah that's read in synagogue. The Torah that you read and you don't, you read the Torah shebichtav. So this is a good sign that Jewish education is supposed to begin at 5. Lema'aseh, in practice, we begin a little earlier. So now in a separate class, we can talk about why upsharing, we start at 3. But from this Mishnah, it looks like you should start Jewish education, at least serious learning, at 5. Ben Eser LeMishnah, and then between the ages of 5 and 10, you learn all of the Tanakh, let's just say. And by the time you become 10, now you're ready to learn Mishnah. That's the oral law. Then it says, Ben Shalosh Esrei LeMitzvot. When he's 13, he is ready to do mitzvot. And this is the source. So it doesn't say anything about manhood, but it does say that at 13 you have mitzvot. Now we'll just go a little further on. Ben Chamesh Esrei LeTalmud. At 15, you start to learn Talmud. It's clearly, you're not really supposed to learn Talmud Be'iyun until you're in high school, but many places do start a little earlier. Ben Shmona Esrei LeChuppah, then you're supposed to get married when you're 18. So there's a problem there because you definitely can't learn the whole Talmud between 15 and 18. So you're going to have to decide what to do. Ben Esrim Lirdov. And then when you're 20, you have to be Rodef, which is to chase after. So there's a question of what it means, Lirdov. One interpretation of Lirdov means that you have to pursue a career. You have to, provide for your family at 20. The other is that the Beit Din, the Jewish courts, do not inflict punishment like malkot, like lashes, are not inflicted on anyone who is younger than 20. So they don't chase after you. Even if you're guilty of a violation, you're not punished with corporal punishment until you're 20. Now, what's interesting about this, clearly it identifies a bar mitzvah boy as related to mitzvot. But there's also so many things that are unclear about it, meaning who's obligated to teach the bar mitzvah boy mikra when they're 5? Their parents, their father, and to teach them Mishnah when they're 10. And who's responsible to teach them Gemara when they are 15? Their Rebbe or their father again. So who's responsible for mitzvot at 13? Is it the bar mitzvah boy that's responsible to mitzvot? Or if it were in keeping with the rest of the Mishnah, it would be that his father is obligated to teach him about mitzvot at 13, which is also problematic because we would identify the beginning of the education as much earlier. A child should already begin to start fasting an hour or two at 9. And as soon as they become aware of how to do a mitzvah, they should be able to do it. Why 13? So I have a number of problems about exactly how to read this Mishnah and whether or not it's a source. It certainly doesn't say have a bar mitzvah party when the boy turns 13. So many commentaries, the Rush feels this way, and Rashi also, I'll show you the Rashi in a second, believe that 13 is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. That is, it is an oral law passed down from the time of Moses, that even though there is no written source word in the Tanakh, that it was always part of the oral Torah. And it falls under a category of what we call shiurim, or measurements, various kinds of measurements like an amma and a tefach, and certain things that in how we measure the performance of mitzvot. One of them is that boys are considered to be bar mitzvah, liable to do mitzvot, when they turn 13. And not only the Rush holds this way, but Rashi holds this way, and a few others mention it as well. The Magen Avot on this Mishnah that we're just reading, and that's the Rush, he's known as the Rashbatz. The Rashbatz writes very simply another way of looking at it. The Ode, moreover, ki bazman hazeh ra'ui laholid. At this time, a boy becomes able to sire a child, have a child. He's sexually mature. Now we asked before, being emotionally mature, financially mature, other things like that, but perhaps it is really about sexual maturity. So when he is able to have a child, then Nikra Ish, then he's called a man. As it says, Kamosha Nizkar, as it's mentioned in the Torah, but Parsha Ben Sorah Remora, V'zelach l'Moshe Misinai. It's halach l'Moshe Misinai. And Rashi says it also in the next source here, Ben Shlosh Esrei mitzvot, Demisha hevish se'arot, someone who has 2 hairs, that means 2 pubic hairs, right? Ba'lichlal mitzvot d'oraita. Then they have to do mitzvot of the Torah. Okay? The halacha l'Moshe Sinai v'shi'aru chachamim, and the rabbis, he's flipping it, Rashi said, flipping it. The rabbis estimated that havat shtei se'arot, that having 2 hairs, lishloshes reishana, is approximately 13 years. So according to Rashi, he's flipping it a little. He's not saying that the halacha l'Moshe Sinai is that 13 is the age. What he's saying is the halacha l'Moshe Sinai is that when you hit puberty, you become liable to do mitzvot. That's what Rashi's saying. And the rabbis estimated that it was 13. Lefikach, therefore, machnisin oto l'kayem mitzvot, therefore we bring him in to do mitzvot. Now, it's interesting what he says here, machnisin oto, that we bring him in. Where do we bring him in? Perhaps it's referring to, it's not clear. Perhaps it means we're bringing him into shul. Like maybe we're bringing him into the shul to do the mitzvot in shul. Maybe it means a house. He says we bring him in to do mitzvot, and from that time and on, then we assume, we estimate, we imagine that it's true by probability that he has the pubic hair that he needs to have. Kedin rov tinokot. Okay, I won't do the rest of it now, because there's a long discussion, which I won't get into now, which is, are they necessary but not sufficient? In other words, we have 2 qualifiers for what makes a boy a bar mitzvah. One is he's 13 years old, and we'll see that means actually 13 years and 1 day, because on your 13th birthday is the day that you complete 13 years, and you only can do the mitzvah of a bar mitzvah, of being bar mitzvah, if you say it correctly, on the first day of your 14th year. So is it being 13 and 1 day, or is it being in puberty? Which is it? Do you need to have one of them or both of them? There's a big discussion about it. What we do in practice is follow what's called the chazaka derava, which is that we assume that most 13-year-olds are physically mature, so we don't check. We just assume they are. This works out fine, and this is how every bar mitzvah boy in the world does it, but it is philosophically problematic in the following way. Since you have a safek, you do have some doubt, in theory, if there was a serious mitzvah, let me take that back. I don't mean to say that some mitzvot are serious and some are not. You have Torah mitzvot and rabbinic mitzvot. If it came to a Torah commandment in which the bar mitzvah boy wanted to lead the congregation, let's say making kiddush on Friday night. Let's assume that he was making kiddush to fulfill a Torah obligation. How can we assume that a 13-year-old can do that unless we know for sure that they have reached puberty? Can we assume that we have some doubt? So we have this potential problem about it, that it works fine for rabbinic laws, but for Torah laws, in the fact that there's some doubt, in theory, one ought to check, but we do not. We just assume that all 13-year-olds are bar mitzvah. I know what the other case was. The other case was, what if you have a yeshiva boy who knows the halacha, and he knows that he is not yet physically mature? Should he tell someone? Should he tell the rabbi? Should he tell his father? I mean, that's extremely private and embarrassing. Who would want to say that? But if he knows the halacha, what should he do? So l'maisa, as I said, in general, we don't worry about such things. We assume that even if both are required, 13 and puberty, that when someone hits 13, that everything's fine. The halacha is as follows, and this is the next source. I wrote here, bar mitzvah's physical maturity. I got ahead of myself. But here's the halacha. This is the Shulchan Aruch. He says, is the laws of the morning prayers. He says, Omrim Kaddish. We say Kaddish. By the way, it's interesting because in Corona Minyanim, according to RCBC guidelines, you start from Kaddish. Like this morning at the outdoor minyan that I was at, they started from Kaddish. So we skipped all the stuff beforehand. So it starts a new siman here. It's siman Nunhei. Omrim Kaddish, you say Kaddish. It's the first thing you need a minyan for. The Ein Omrim Oto, you don't say Kaddish, but Pachut mi Yud Zecharim, unless you have 10 men, 10 males. B'nei Chorin, who are free, that is not slaves. Gidolim, and they have to be adults. Sheviu Shnei Sarot, that have physical maturity. V'hu adin l'kedusha, and the same thing is true of kedusha, ubarfu and barfu, she'ein nemer pachum asara. So kaddish, kedusha, and barfu, these are things that we call dvarim shebi kedusha. They must be said only in the presence of someone who is a gadol, as opposed to a katan, someone who's an adult. So what does Rabbi Ovadia Mibar Tanura say in his interpretation of this? This is a little out of order. Rabbi Ovadia is commenting on the Mishnah that we read above, Ben Shlosh Yisrael Mitzvah, not on the Shulchan Aruch. I just brought them together. Rabbi Ovadia says on the Mishnah, Dichtiv, Ish o Isha, a man or a woman. And here it clearly mentions in the Torah an equivalency between men and women. Ish o Isha, a man or a woman, ki yasu mikol chatota adam, when they will do any sin. Now, this is a particular sin. This parsha is talking about the sin of me'ilah, which is misusing property that is holy to the Beit HaMikdash, Hekdesh. But it says that when you do this sin, a man or a woman, if they do this sin, then they are guilty and they have to do tshuva. That's what it says in this section. So Rabbi Ovadia says, what does it mean, ish o isha? He says, ben shlosh Yisrael mitzvah. That is the meaning. The reason that a 13-year-old is bar mitzvah or is liable to do mitzvot is because at that point they are a man or a woman. So we have three topics that we're conflating together so far. It's not so complicated, but it's worth realizing that they are separate. Number one is being a man. Number two is being liable for mitzvot. And number three is hitting puberty. It's not clear that all three of these things are exactly the same. For which we'll move on to our next possible definition, which is that bar mitzvah is about moral maturity, not about sexual maturity, but about moral maturity. How do we know this is true? I'll show you. If there are any questions, people can unmute or they can put it in the chat, I guess, right? You guys can take care of that. Fine, let me know. All right, so we have a pasuk in Breshit. Look at this pasuk. This is referring to Yaakov and Esav. Vayigdilu hane'arim, the boys or the young men grew up. Vayhi Esav, and Esav became Ish Yodei Tzayid, a man who knew how to hunt. Ish Sadeh, a man of the field. Yaakov Ishtam, and Yaakov was a simple man or a pure man. Yoshev Oalim, who dwelt in tents. Now notice a couple of words here that we already know are markers. Number one, it says Vayigdilu. They grew up. So we know that we call an adult a gadol and a minor is a katan. And the second thing is it refers to both Yaakov and Esav, who were twins, so they have the same birthday, right? As Ish. Esav is an Ish and Yaakov is an Ish. So right away, the rabbis, Chazal, are interested in this. So Rashi brings a famous comment. I don't know, I guess a famous comment of, they say a famous comment of Rashi is a comment that you know. Whether or not everybody else knows it or not, it's an open question. Rashi brings a comment. He says, he's quoting the Midrash. Kol zman shayu ketanim, as long as Yaakov and Esav were little, lo hayu nikarim b'masehem, they were not noticeable in their actions. Ve'ena damedaktik bahem mativam, and no one paid close attention to see what their nature was. Now, this probably means that as opposed to helicopter parenting in the times of the Tanakh, like nobody paid attention to the children at all. They were just children. Kevan shenasu b'nei 13 shana, when they became 13 years old, Zeh peirash lebatei midrashot, this one went off to the Beis Medrash, Zeh peirash lavodat elalim, and this one went off to paganism and to idol worship. So according to Rashi, this statement of Vayigdilu hane'arim should be connected to the idea of becoming bar mitzvah. And he's saying what it means that they grew up is they became bar mitzvah. And at the time of their bar mitzvah, their paths diverged. Yaakov made a moral religious choice to be frum, and Esav made a moral religious choice to be pagan. Now, the thing is, there's a few things that are interesting in the way Rashi quotes the Midrash. So let's just do the Midrash for a second. There's two very specific differences in Rashi and the Midrash on which Rashi bases himself. So here he says, Vayigdilu hane'arim, Rabbi Levi Amar, Mashal lahadas ve'itzvonit. So Rashi didn't mention this analogy. between a hadas, which is a myrtle, like we use in our lulav and etrog, and an itzvonit, which is a thorn bush. Shayu gedelim ze al gabi ze. They're growing right next to each other. The kevin shigdilu vifrichu zen notein recho. When the myrtle bush grows up, it gives off a beautiful fragrance. V'zeh chocho, and when the thorn bush grows up, it gives off thorns that make you bleed and catch in your clothes. So what's interesting about the way that the Midrash reads as opposed to Rashi is that the Midrash seems to indicate that Esav was always a bad apple. It's not that they were kids and then they reached 13 and they had to make a choice about what kind of adult they were going to be. And they just made the bad, and one made a good choice, one made a bad choice. According to the Midrash, Esav was always a bad apple. It's just that he was an immature bad apple and then he became a mature bad apple. So that's one difference between them. And that sort of takes away from our case. Like whoever you are as a kid, that's who you are as a kid, but you're just immature, you're a little kid. You become bar mitzvah, now you have a moral choice to make. Who am I going to be? So the Midrash takes away from that a little. And then let's look at the end of the Midrash. Amar Rebbe Lazar. Rebbe Lazar says, Rashi leaves this off, but it's very interesting. Tzarich Adam, a person needs lihitapel bivno, to take care of his son, ad yud gimel shana. Mikan va'elach, from then and on, tzarich sheyomar, he should say, Baruch sheptarani me'on sheshalzeh. Now this is the source, which is not found in the Torah or the Tanakh, and it's not found in the Gemara, of Baruch Sheptarani. The custom is, and I did this past Shabbos, is the father gets up after his son gets his aliyah, and he puts his hands on his heads, and he says, Baruch Sheptarani me'on sheshalzeh, blessed are you, Hashem, that you have freed me from the punishment of this one. And this is the source for that. There is a Mahloket between, we probably won't have time to look at it. I don't know what probably won't get to it. We'll say it now. There's a Mahloket between the Ramah and the Gra about whether or not you should say it as a real bracha. So the Ramah says, don't say it. You say it the way we say it. You say, Baruch Sheptarani me'on sheshalzeh. And his reason for that is only because it's not mentioned in the Gemara, and he feels like you shouldn't say brachot that are not in the Gemara. But the Gra says, but here it is in the Midrash Rabbah, and it's found in other places, so you can say it. So according to the Gra, you would say, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, Baruch Sheptarani me'on sheshalzeh. You would say it as a full bracha. This is a question that's dependent on custom. Ashkenazi custom, to follow the Ramah, we don't say it with Shem or Malchut. We don't say Hashem or Melech Haolam. But Rashi, interestingly, leaves that out, which is the specific connection to Bar Mitzvah. Now, before we go on, I'll just mention very briefly that this whole Midrash is extremely problematic. There is a competing Midrash and many other sources that seem to indicate that if you do the math, that this story of Esav and Yaakov, and what happens right after this is the lentil stew, when he sells him the birthright, that this happens when they are 15 years old. Based on the idea that Yaakov was making lentils because Avraham had died, and he was making a mourner's meal for his father Yitzchak. If you do the math on that, it comes out that they were 15 years old, which is still a good time for people to decide who they want to be in their lives, in high school, but it would not then be a source for bar mitzvah. So it's a very problematic source because it seems weird. It doesn't seem to work chronologically to say they were 13, even though I just showed you several sources, including Rashi, that seem to indicate that they were. Okay, fine. All right, so let's talk about Baruch Sheptarani for a second. So the custom is that the way it says in the Midrash is that once a son turns 13, you say Baruch Sheptarani me'on sheshalzeh. One of the things it does not say there is that you have to do it after your son gets an aliyah, or in a minyan, or with the Torah out. So these are things that are customary, but it would seem to me that even if you were unable to have a bar mitzvah because you were davening at home, you didn't have a minyan, you didn't have Torah reading, but your son became bar mitzvah, that you would still be able to say Baruch Sheptarani me'on sheshalzeh, because it doesn't seem that it's limited by shul or minyan. But ask your local Orthodox rabbi. Ask if this is a practical question. If you ask Rabbi Rothbachs. Now, what does it mean, though? Here's an interesting mahloket, or an interesting division. There's two opinions. The Magen Avram cites them both, and I'll read it here for you. It's source E. Meaning, he says, until now, the father was punished when the son sinned, since he did not educate him properly. In other words, the father has a responsibility to his son to teach him how to act. And if the son does something inappropriate, he eats a cheeseburger on Cedar Lane, right? So the father gets the punishment or accrues the avon for that action, not the son, because it was the father's job to teach his son not to do that. It was his responsibility. So then at the point when he says, Barbershop Dharmani, he goes, I am now making a brachat Hashem, a blessing of gratitude, that now his actions are on his own cheshbon. They go on his own bill, and I only am responsible for my own sins. If we look at it that way, which is the general way of looking at it, it's a little problematic because you're basically saying, thank you, God, for getting rid of this horrible burden of my son's sins on me. And it doesn't seem very celebratory or like you want to sing Mazel Tov. It sounds kind of like dysfunctional in a way. The Levush says it the opposite way, though. The Levush says, until now, the son was punished for the father. So the father is saying, actually, to the son, now, my son, you're not under my thumb. I controlled you completely as your father when you were a child. Now you're your own man. So it's the blessing that accrues to the son that now he is responsible for his own actions and he's not completely boxed in by his father, so to speak. I don't know if it's a better interpretation or not, but it's very interesting. Okay. So on this midrash, I wanted to just mention two other things. One is this Mishnah Brura. So the Mishnah Brura says, I'll just do it in the English for time's sake. He takes the general view, the more common view. Until now, the father was punished when the son sinned, since he did not educate him properly the mitzvah of the Torah. He's almost completely quoting the Magen Avram. And now that he's become a man, he's obligated to strengthen himself to Hashem's mitzvah. Oh, so here the Mishnah Brura says, the son now has an obligation to be a moral actor. Up until now, he only did mitzvah because his father forced him to do them. His father said, you got to be in shul on time. You got to put on your tzitzit. You have to say benching, right? He forced him to do it. Now the son has to be mitchazek himself to do it. So he becomes the moral actor. What about the father? And now that even though he no longer has the idea of education, the inyan of education, of chinuch, the father nonetheless still has the mitzvah of rebuke, hochacha, when he sees his son acting improperly. According to the Mishnah Brura, technically, a father's halachic obligation to educate his son ends at bar mitzvah. You have to educate him about all the mitzvah because as soon as he becomes bar mitzvah, he's liable for all the mitzvah. He has to know what to do. But at that point, it's over. You're not responsible to educate him anymore. He says, so in that case, does that mean that a father is done? He has no responsibilities? So Mishnah Brura says, no, he still has the same responsibility to his son that he would have to any other person. And that is, hocheach tochiach et amitecha, to chastise him if he's doing the wrong thing, to get him to do the right thing. Now, we know that this is a problem. There's a long discussion about whether or not we can do the mitzvah of tochacha these days or not. Should we stop every Jew that we see doing something we think is wrong and start lecturing them? Like, generally speaking, we are very reticent to do that. Perhaps we'd make an exception for a father and a son. After all, a 13-year-old boy still definitely needs some tochacha. Alternatively, it could mean that it just means that his father doesn't have to pay for his education anymore, which would be very interesting since there are still a lot of years of tuition that he still has to pay since his son will only be in 7th grade. But you know, that maybe that's all Lifnei Mishura Sadin. The other thing I wanted to mention is I wanted to talk about the bat mitzvah, because in the commentaries on the Midrash, there's a commentary called the Radal. And the Radal asks this question. He says, why doesn't the father say Baruch Sheptarani Me'on Shel Zeh on a girl? He says, after all, if the issue is that the boy is liable to do mitzvot, so is the girl liable to do mitzvot. They're both liable to do mitzvot. They might not be the exact same mitzvot. For instance, the boy has a mitzvah to put tefillin on and to say Shema, and the girl has different mitzvot that she has to do. They're not exactly the same mitzvah, but the mitzvah that apply to them apply. So he asked this question, which I think is a very good question. He answers as follows. He says, Barbershop Dharmani is only about the obligation of teaching Torah to his son. That a father has his obligation until his son is bar mitzvah of teaching him Torah, which for sure refers also to a financial component, that he has to either teach him or hire someone to teach him. And because it is specifically the mitzvah of Talmud Torah as a complete mitzvah only applies to boys and not to girls, therefore Barbershop Dharmani would not be said for girls. This is a little strange and hard to totally understand because girls also have a responsibility to learn Talmud Torah, perhaps not in the same lishma obligation that boys have, but they certainly have an obligation to learn Torah, to do all the mitzvot that they're required to do. I don't know what people do, honestly, but it would be an interesting question that if you would also, it would seem to me not to violate any halachot. It's possible that it's violating minhagim. I don't know for sure. To say Barbershop Dharmani Me'onshu Shel Zeh for a girl as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be done by a Torah. It doesn't have to be done necessarily by a shul. It had the same idea of moral responsibility and mitzvah responsibility would apply. So both, it would seem like a father could do it to a daughter and a mother could do it to a son. Mother to a son is a different question. She also, Al titosh Torah simecha, maybe it applies as well. Or perhaps, and I know some people do this, to have both parents say it on the son, even though the minhag is to have a father do it. It is always been a minhag. It is the fact that the Ramah says that you should only say it without shem u'malchut shows that it's not really a halacha. It's just a minhag that developed. So again, as far as practical issue, ask your local Orthodox rabbi what you should do if you want to say Barbershop Dharmani says that. Maybe there are reasons not to do it, of which I am unaware. I'm just showing you the original sources. Okay, let's see, related to this idea that the father has to give tochacha to his son, let's take a look at the next source here. In Breshit Lamed Daled is the story of the rape of Dinah. And after Dinah is raped by Hamor the son of
about Rabbi Heller.
Yeah.
Rabbi
Okay.
what?
You're saying hello. Okay. After Dinah is taken by Shechem's son, two of her brothers, Shimon and Levi, go out and perpetrate an act of incredible violence on the city of Shechem. That's what it says here in the pasuk. On the third day, they had asked all the men of Shechem to get circumcised so that Dinah could marry their chieftain. And the two sons of Yaakov, Shimon and Levi, the brothers of Dinah, Ish Harbo, they each took their sword. Look at the word here. Ish Harbo. Each man took his sword, and they went into Shechem. So Midrash Rabbah says there, on this pasuk, Ish Harbo, Rebbe Lazar Omer, Ben Shlosh Yisrei Shana Hayu. They were 13. He says it because it says Ish, they were men. So they did a very manly thing, even though it was a very cruel and violent thing. Some sources in Pirkei Avot argue that this is the real source for Ben Shlosh Yisrei LeMitzvot, which is so strange because it's not an act that we would generally associate as being a positive act. Even if you want to say that they were standing up for their sister's honor, even if you want to say, like the Rambam does, that the men of Shechem were liable for death by being complicit in Dinah's abduction, it's still not a very positive story. So perhaps another way to view it is what happens at the end of the story is that Yaakov chastises his sons. He tells them that they did the wrong thing. They argue with him, but he chastises them and says, you have made me ugly in the eyes of my neighbors. And so perhaps this idea that Mishnah Berurah mentioned, that a father still has an obligation, even after the bar mitzvah, to do tochacha to his sons, is evinced from here that Yaakov is mochiach Shimon and Levi. There is also a problem with this midrash, which is that the math is very difficult. There are a few commentaries that try to really figure out how it could be that Levi was 13 years old at this time. but the math and the chronology is difficult. I mean, they were teenagers, but it doesn't seem to work out as exactly as you would like. Okay, so moving on to an additional topic, which is making a bar mitzvah party. So we've talked about the idea of bar mitzvah being physical maturity, of being a technical responsibility to do mitzvot, of being emotional maturity. Let's talk a little bit about, through the idea of the bar mitzvah party, religious responsibility. So here's another, everything from Bereshit tonight. Here's the next source. What time is it? Okay, we got a few minutes. Here's the pasuk is related to the birth of Yitzchak. So we know that Avram had to wait many years to have a son, and he didn't think he was going to be able to have a son. He thought Ishmael was going to be his son for a while. Finally, Sarah Imenu has a son, and this is the pasuk that happens after that. It says, "Vayigdal hayeled," the child grew up. Now we already know that this word Vayigdal is going to be interpreted by the rabbis as he became gadol, he became an adult. It's a little problematic because it says hayeled. A yeled is a child, not even a na'ar, not a lad, not a preteen, or but a child. It says the child grew up, vayigamal, and he was weaned. Vayas Avraham mishteh gadol, and Avram made a big party. Biyom higam elet Yitzchak, on the day that Yitzchak was weaned. Now, this might be a simple pasuk. In other words, Rashi interprets it in a simple way. Vayigamal, and he was weaned. L'sof chafdalad chodesh, after 24 months. In other words, the halachic definition of a nursing mother is 2 years. That's the general halachic definition. So Rashi is saying when Yitzchak stopped nursing, at the end of 2 years, Avram made a party. It's interesting because we don't make parties. There are no weaning parties. There are no celebrations in Jewish life that I'm aware of that are weaning parties. So based on Avram's example, you would think we would have such a party. However, the Midrash interprets it differently, or brings a Mahloket. Midrash Rabbah here says, "Vayigdala yeled vayigamal." What does it mean that he was weaned? Rabbi Hoshaya Rabbah Amar Nigmal miyetzer hara. He was weaned away from the evil inclination. Now the Rabbanan Amar Nigmal mechalavo. Rabbanan say weaned from his milk, so that's 2 years. But Rabbi Hoshaya says he was weaned away from the evil inclination. How do we understand this? So the Eitz Yosef commentary on the Midrash Rabbah explains as follows. Perush, Shanasa ben Yud Gimel Shana, he became bar mitzvah. Yitzchak, it was his bar mitzvah. Sha'az nigmal hanar miyetzer hara, he was weaned away from the evil inclination. Shehu koach hatava, which is the power of lust or desire. Hachomrit, which is physical. V'nichnas mo koach yetzer hatov, and it entered into him the power of the good inclination. V'lachein, and therefore, me'az hu mitzuvah ve'oseh. From that point on, he was commanded to do mitzvot, and he did mitzvot. U'lesimcha zu, because of this great simcha, that he now had a yetzer hatov, asa Avraham mishteh. Avraham made a party. So Avraham made a party because of his ability now to use the power of his yetzer hatov. I'll just share with you this source from Torah Binatan before I explain it, which is a famous source. It just says here, Yetzer hara ketzad. It says in Pirkei Avot that Yetzer hara takes a person out of this world. How does it take a person out of this world? Amru, they said, Shlosh Esrei shana gadol Yetzer hara mi Yetzer tov. For the first 13 years of your life, your Yetzer hara is much more powerful than your Yetzer hatov. He gets his Yetzer hara, his evil inclination, from the time he's born. Gadal ubayimo, it goes and gets bigger as he grows, it grows. V'hitchil mechalel shabbatot, and then he starts being mechalel Shabbat. As a child, he's not obligated, but he's, doing things he's not supposed to do on Shabbat. Ein memacheh biyado, nobody says anything to him. I skip the next line. La'achar yud gimel shana, after 13 years, nolad yetzer hatov, he gets his good inclination. Kevan shemachalel shabbatot, when he starts being machalel Shabbat, chash v'shalom, after his bar mitzvah, Amar lei, his good inclination says to him, Reka, you are worthless. Mechalel mochumat, don't you know that a person who's machalel Shabbat is liable for death? Go do the right thing. So this is a tradition that when a child is born, he's completely selfish. That's his Yetzer Hara. As you get older, you begin to learn more and more about taking care of other people and about being selfless. That's your Yetzer HaTov. So the demarcating value when your Yetzer HaTov becomes strong enough to oppose your Yetzer Hara is at your bar mitzvah. So this used to be a big joke in our house when my older son got bar mitzvah, when Madad was bar mitzvah, which was about 5 or 6 years ago. The whole year before he was bar mitzvah, anytime he did something wrong, he would say, Abba, you can't blame me. I don't have a Yetzer HaTov, right? I have no Yetzer HaTov. Babe, when I have a Yetzer HaTov, you can give me a hard time, but right now, come on, what do you want from me? We should never have learned this about Torah Binatan. So that's what he used to say. So this idea that children now have the ability at 13 to make moral choices is rooted in this idea that at this point their Yetzer HaTov begins to become stronger and stronger. Now the Eitz Yosef adds in one extra thing, which is that there's a difference in halacha between mitzvah ve'oseh, a person who's commanded to do something and does it, and eno mitzvah ve'oseh, someone who's not commanded and does it. And in halacha, being commanded to do something and doing it is always better. So no matter even if you were a smart kid and a morally strong kid and whatever, if you're not required to do something, you're always doing it for extra credit. And extra credit is always easier to do than the main part of the assignment. So there is a changeover moment here when every mitzvah you do it because you were commanded to do it. For that, you get tremendous schar. And it was based on this idea that the Midrash suggests that Avram made a party. So the origin of a bar mitzvah party seems to have to do with this celebration of the Yetzer HaTov helping a bar mitzvah boy do the mitzvot that he is required to do now. I'm going to skip the next source, which I summarized for you. There is another source that's usually cited for bar mitzvah parties, which is the Yam Shel Shlomo, Reb Shlomo Luria. And he mentions here in Bava Kama, he says, any feast that a person does that's not for the sake of socializing and celebrating, but in order to give praise to Hashem, or to publicize a mitzvah, or to publicize a miracle, these are called mitzvah meals, su'udat mitzvah, a mitzvah feast. So he says a bar mitzvah feast that the Ashkenazim do, I guess only the Ashkenazim did it at that time, it seems there's no greater su'udat mitzvah than this. For the young man has become bar mitzvah, and greater is the one who does so out of commandment, mitzvah v'yoseh, and the father is merited to raise him until now to bring him into the covenant of Torah. So the celebration of a bar mitzvah party is to celebrate the ability to make good moral choices and good religious choices. It's interesting, according to the Mishnah Berurah, you really should only be able to make the bar mitzvah celebration on the day of one's bar mitzvah, because that's the moment. So really, it should be, the day after you turn 13, the first day of your 14th year, that's when you should do it. So it turns out that we can do it anyway, but it's better to make it to give us another reason to celebrate. So like if the bar mitzvah boy makes a siyum, or if he teaches some Torah, so then you have another reason to sanctify the meal, which may be the source for the idea that bar mitzvah, not historically, but maybe religiously a source for bar mitzvah boys giving a drasha or a dvar Torah, is that it's part of what turns the kiddush into a sudat mitzvah. You could argue that the sudat mitzvah is a mitzvah if that day is the very, very first day that he could possibly have laned or gotten on the aliyah. But many times it works out that a bar mitzvah boy becomes bar mitzvah on Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday, and Shabbos is just when everybody comes to shul. So in that case, if he gives a drasha, that gives a reason for the kiddush to be considered, or the meal to be considered a sudat mitzvah, and that may be where that came from. So the other traditional acts of bar mitzvah, we're not going to go into detail about these things, but there are a few other things that seem to particularly relate to bar mitzvahs. One are putting on tefillin, and I think it's a very obvious symbol, which maybe is perhaps why we associate it, but we don't tend to do bar mitzvah celebrations with tefillin. Our bar mitzvah celebrations are very centered around Kriyat HaTorah, Whereas, let's say if the first day that you should do, that you should put on your tefillin is a Tuesday, there's no Kriyat Torah, it would seem like you could celebrate the putting on of the tefillin. It's an expensive item, you just got it. So it could be that the reason why that's not true is because our custom is that bar mitzvah boys start putting on tefillin a month before their bar mitzvahs, or several weeks before their bar mitzvahs. That when that custom developed, certainly it took away from the impact of putting on tefillin for the first time. But maybe we should celebrate making a minyan, right? The first time you go to shul when you're a bar mitzvah boy, suddenly you can make a minyan. So I think that's probably also didn't become a source of celebration because it's not nikar. It's not so obvious. If there's 50 men in shul, it's not so obvious that you're the guy. Although, like in my family, when we have me and my older son, when my younger son became bar mitzvah, he was really excited that he got to make the mezuzah. So that didn't happen right away. You're not going to get to your meal. Like your shul is going to come before meal, but that was really exciting for him. I would argue that probably the first thing that a bar mitzvah boy does that he is required to do as reaching the Gil mitzvot is probably saying Shema at night when he becomes bar mitzvah. That's probably, unless you say that it starts in the morning, but I don't see why it should. Saying Shema, so like, I don't know why we don't have bar mitzvah celebrations at night for when they first says the Shema. Maybe it's not, exciting enough. So it seems also that the reason that boys read the Torah is, I don't know. I didn't do a forensic dive into it, and we don't have time to really go into it or look at the original sources because we only have a few minutes left. But it seems like the reason that they called boys up for an aliyah was a way of publicizing that he became a bar mitzvah. In other words, they didn't do invitations and they didn't necessarily have big parties. So the way in which you would publicize that the boy was a bar mitzvah was that you would call him up for an aliyah, which, by the way, is the same reason for ufraf. If you don't have invitations and nobody, the only way you're going to know that two people are getting married is you call the chatan up, and then everybody knows when you call them up as Yamod HaChatan that they're getting married. So it seems like the only reason to call up the bar mitzvah boy was to publicize that he was bar mitzvah. And to give, I guess it's exciting to have the first chance to say a bracha on the Torah, although in many communities, like the Yemenite communities, they have little kids making brachot on the Torah all the time, as early as several years before their bar mitzvah. So I don't know. I mean, it's still exciting if it's the first official time. In any case, in ancient times, not that ancient, but the way the Torah was supposed to be read is that when you called someone up to read the Torah, they didn't just make the brachot, they also laned. It's only nowadays, over time, that's developed that people are able to make the brachot on the Torah, sometimes not even make the brachot on the Torah unless they get a lot of help. And they certainly cannot lane it. So we now have, professional and volunteer Bali Kriya who do the Torah reading, even though they're not the ones being called up. So it seems likely to me that the original custom was simply that a bar mitzvah boy was called up for an aliyah and he read his aliyah. That was fine. But now that we developed the thing that one person reads the whole parsha, so the outcome of that is that all the poor bar mitzvah boys now have to learn a whole bar mitzvah parsha instead of just their aliyah. They have gotten completely, put under the gun based on the development of the professional Bal Kriya class. I don't know if that's true, but it just was what it seems like to me. Okay, just some concluding thoughts about this, and this applies both to regular bar mitzvahs and to corona bar mitzvahs. As we've seen, there are very, very few biblical sources, and even the biblical sources that exist are really just illusions. And no sources really in the Gemara related to how to celebrate a child becoming an adult. We have this idea that it may be a halacha l'Moshe miSinai, that at the moment when a boy or a girl, when a boy becomes 13 or when a girl becomes 12, that they are liable for mitzvot. And that is a very important Torah level thing, meaning the difference between whether or not you're obligated b'doraita to do a mitzvah or not is a very big moment. And it has many applications in halacha all over the place, both for boys and for girls. So that is really important. That idea that suddenly you become liable for mitzvot seems to be halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and it has many, many Torah nafkaminas, has many offshoots or applications. However, the way to celebrate a bar mitzvah for a boy or for a girl seems to have developed a little bit at a time without very, very strong specifics. And even today, you see that there are some differences in the way that that communities celebrate bar mitzvahs. It's not the same things are done in every way. It's interesting, in the Sephardic community, they call the bar mitzvah, the bar mitzvah boys are called chatan bar mitzvah. They're called bridegrooms. And if you go to the Kotel, you'll often see many, many Sephardic families, because Sephardic families, as opposed to Ashkenazic families, even if they're really not religious, they still want to go to the Kotel to celebrate the bar mitzvah. So you'll see many of them, and often they hire a band and they have a chuppah that they carry over the bar mitzvah boy, and they dance him down to the Kotel. It's a very beautiful idea. I think that it's connected to the idea that you were not responsible, you were free, and now you are responsible. Just like when a husband and a wife get married, they were responsible only to themselves, and now they're responsible for each other. So it's a nice idea. And it is the general idea, which I think is an area that has been hard for us in America to carry off, which is to say that becoming bar mitzvah is more about an increase in your responsibility and your maturity than it is about your privileges and your entitlements. Just like it is with birthdays, so to speak, like when you're becoming bar mitzvah, you expect your parents to throw you a party. You expect to get a lot of gifts. You expect that whoever else wanted to lay in the Torah that week, that you're the one who gets to read, and that your family gets the aliyahs that week, and that, that you get to meet with the rabbi then. There's a lot of, privileges that accrue, and it's easy to begin to see these celebrations as a kind of privilege. And if you view it that way, especially if you're a 13-year-old and you view this as privileges that you're supposed to get, and then all of a sudden you can't have a bar mitzvah because of Corona, you're certainly going to feel very put upon, because all the things that were your privileges were taken away. But the more that you are focused on it, or think about it, or refract it as an increase in responsibility, you see that your responsibilities, if anything, increase in this time. You have a responsibility to keep people safe. You have a responsibility to defer your own enjoyment for the sake of others, which is in some ways the definition of adulthood. You have responsibilities to your community, right? Now, I don't think all 13-year-olds have these abilities naturally per se. So I do think that we have to help them find ways, and often not ways of just telling them, hey, why don't you think more about being responsible than about being privileged? I don't know if that works. But that's why some of these sort of creative ideas that have happened in recent times, whether it's making siyumim, which is a real investment in learning Torah so that your bar mitzvah is an accomplishment of what you've done and not an entitlement, are really good. Or having, doing bat mitzvah projects where you are doing something for tzedakah or something to donate, that instills an idea of responsibility more than entitlement. Even doing a program where mothers and daughters are learning together is instilling this idea of obligation to learn and something that you've accomplished rather than entitlement. So I think all of these things are true in general, and it's something that we have to subtly think about. I think there's a lot of flexibility in how we celebrate this life, this life change, and that the ways in which we do it should reflect that idea of bringing our children into greater responsibility. And I think that that can be done in a Corona time as well, even though I know I'm just brushing over it. But I give my son a lot of credit, and I don't know how much we had to do with it. That despite the fact that his party got canceled or deferred, despite the fact that he didn't think he was going to have a minyan, and he spent 100 hours being berated by his father to learn the longest parsha in the Torah, Naso, that, he kind of kept it on an even keel. He never cried or was bitter or said like, oh, I'm not getting my bar mitzvah that I always dreamed of. And then when it got sprung on him that he was going to have to review his whole parsha the last week and still lane it, he like jumped right into it. Now, I don't know if that can be true with every bar mitzvah boy and bat mitzvah girl, or if every parent, even doing the best they can instill it. But I think it is something to aspire to. I hope that I think we are to some degree successful in this. I hope that we will continue to be more successful in raising our children to feel connected to and responsible to Torah and mitzvot. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to take any questions. I'm going to unshare my screen, and that's it.
Thank you for that. It was great. I appreciate all the sources. It seems like your son did a great job of just adapting to the changed environment, being able to jump right back in. Just observing him with the changes. What do you think was the most challenging thing for him, through the process? Is it uncertainty or some of the adjustments you mentioned earlier?
I think the hardest thing for him was not being able to celebrate with his friends. So that's legit. So, he has taken it in stride that he will get to, just not right now. And I think he's really accepted the idea that this is not something, which is hard actually for children. This is not something afflicting me. This is something afflicting everyone. If you can hop that idea, it's very liberating. Yeah, I'm having a hard time, but it's not because Hashem is punishing me. It's because we're all in this together. And then when I asked him, what was the thing that he really, really wanted? Because we did this little kind of dinky backyard minyan. So I said, what do you really, really want from this? Like, what's the thing that you're most excited about? He's like, I really want to have like a big flourishing yamod. Like, I really want like a chazonish yamod. And I was like, oh, I would have had no idea, but like, sure, we could do that. No problem. We'll whoop it up.
That's great. I do like a good yamod myself, so I can appreciate that. For the people that did miss their, get the opportunity to lane in shul, what are people doing? Are people just really just waiting to next year and say, well, we'll get my opportunity then? Or have you seen any other adjustments that people are trying to make up for, that missed opportunity of doing something public?
Yeah, so there are a couple of interesting tshuvas about this. Actually, I literally did not think about it until you mentioned it right now, but there are a couple of tshuvas about this that would make an interesting class all by themselves. Rav Shechter wrote a tshuva about it, and I think also Rav Usher Weiss wrote a tshuva about it, about what options are available for bar mitzvah boys in shuls. There's a separate halacha in shuls that if you miss a week of Torah reading, that you're supposed to make it up the next week. But then there's a mahloket about whether or not that only applies to one makeup. Just like, if you were unable to daven shachrit, you can do tashlumin for mincha. So like if you miss 1 week of Torah reading, you can make it up the next week, but does it carry forward and forward and forward? Most posts can say no. There's some posts can say, why not? Maybe it should, it also, most posts can say that it applies only to communities, not to individuals. But it is true that when the Chazon Ish was in jail, he got thrown in jail for a couple of weeks. When he got out of jail, he convened a minyan in his house or something like that, a separate minyan, and they laned like 5 parshas in a row so that he could catch up. So they talked about this a little bit. The problem is how many Shabbases did we miss? How many parshas? Maybe 12. So more than that, 14. So in theory, if it wasn't a tircha tzibura, if you had the reshut of the whole community, they could say, yes, we're going to make up all 14 parshas this week. We'll just sit in shul for 3 hours and do Kriyas Torah. But nobody wants to do that. So probably from a communal perspective, those parshot are lost. But Rav Shechter in his tshuva gives a very creative possible solution, which is that it's possible that you could double up the parsha and then do the bar mitzvah parsha like this. Let's say that, so this week is Balotcha. So let's say you had a bar mitzvah boy who missed his parsha was Kitisa. And now it's Ba'alotcha. So you'll lane Ba'alotcha. And I can't remember, I have to look, I didn't look at the tshuva before this class. I can't remember exactly how he says to do it, but you basically lane Ba'alotcha, which is this Shabbos' Parsha. And then afterwards, the bar mitzvah boy could come up and lane Kitisa. And in that way, you'd make up that Parsha for the community, and the bar mitzvah boy would still get to lane his Parsha. It's not the Parsha of the week, but you could just do it. You'd still have to get the permission of the shul to sit there for an extra Torah, for Torah reading, but there might be enough goodwill and rahmanis in people for one parsha. But then the question is, if you have 10 bar mitzvah boys over the course of the corona, do you want to do this for the next 2 months? So it's an interesting question, and we'll see. There was a lot of talk about it at the beginning of the quarantine, and I haven't heard rabbis talk about what they're actually doing now that shuls are starting to reopen yet. So we'll see how it shakes out.
Great. Thank you for the insight. Really appreciate it. I don't know if anybody has any other questions. I know we're getting close to Mitzvah Marv time. But I just wanted to thank you again for joining. It was a really great share, and I really appreciate it.
Really a pleasure. I do have the source materials. I'll save them as a PDF and send them to you, Jesse. And if anybody wants them, they can get them from me.
Great. And we're also recording this, and I think Eliza's planning to post online as well.
Okay.
So
Yes.
people that weren't able to
Probably
attend.
it may take a day or two, but it should be on bethaaron.org/Torah if you want to direct people to it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, and have a great night.
Thank you. Have a wonderful night.